The First Anglo-Burmese War, also known as the First Burma War, was the first of three wars fought between the British and Burmese empires in the 19th century. The war, which began primarily over the control of northeastern India, ended in a decisive British victory, giving the British total control of Assam, Manipur, Kashmir and Jaintia as well as Arakan province and Tenasserim. The Burmese were also forced to pay an indemnity of £1 million and sign a commercial treaty. 15,000 European and Indian soldiers died, together with an unknown number of Burmese military and civilian casualties. The high cost of the campaign to the British, £5 to £13 million, contributed to a severe economic crisis in British India which cost the East India Company its remaining privileges. For the Burmese Empire, it was the beginning of the end of their independence. The Burmese would be crushed for years to come by repaying the large indemnity of £1 million, a large sum at that time. The British would wage two more wars against a much weakened Burma, and swallow up the entire country by 1885. Causes. By 1822, Burmese expansion into Manipur and Assam had created a long border between British India and the Burmese Empire. The British, based in Calcutta, supported rebels from Manipur, Assam and Arakan fleeing into British territory. Calcutta unilaterally declared Kashmir and Jaintia British protectorates, and sent in troops. Cross-border raids into these newly acquired territories from British territories and spheres of influence vexed the Burmese. Convinced that war was inevitable, Burmese Commander-in-Chief, Maha Bandula, became a main proponent of offensive policy against the British. Bandula was part of the war party at Bagayador's court, which also included Queen Minu and her brother, the Lord of Salon. Bandula believed that a decisive victory could allow Ava to consolidate its gains in its new Western Empire in Arakan, Manipur, Assam, Kashmir and Jaintia, as well as take over eastern Bengal. In September 1823, the casus belli was Burma occupying Shalpuri Island near Chittagong, which was claimed by the East India Company. In January 1824, Burma sent one of their top generals, Thadathira Mahauzana, into Kashmir and Jaintia to disperse the rebels. The British sent in their own force to meet the Burmese in Kashmir, resulting in the first clashes between the two. The war formally broke out on 5 March 1824, following border clashes in Arakan. The British reason for the war was, in addition to expanding British Bengal's sphere of influence, the desire for new markets for British manufacturing. The British were also anxious to deny the French the use of Burmese harbours and concerned about French influence at the court of Ava, as the kingdom was still known to them. British Ambassador Michael Symes's mission was equipped to gain as much knowledge as possible of the country for future British plans, whereas previous envoys were concerned principally with trade concessions. Anglo-French rivalry had already played a role during Along Paya's endeavours of unifying the kingdom. The Burmese in these wars were advancing into smaller states not ruled by the British or the subject of expansionary goals by the British before the war began, and the British were not so much preoccupied by the refugee problem initially as by the threat posed by the French until further incidents forced their hand. War. Western Theatre. The commander-in-chief of the Burmese army, Maha Bandula, was supported by 12 of the country's best divisions, including one under his personal command, all totaling 10,000 men and 500 horses. His general staff included some of the country's most decorated soldiers, men like the Lord of Sallee and the governors of Danyawadi, Wantha and Taumgu. Bandula's plan was to attack the British on two fronts: Chittagong from Arakan in the southeast, and Sylhet from Kashmir and Jaintia in the north. Bandula personally commanded the Arakan theatre while Uzana commanded Kashmir and Jaintia theatre. Early in the war, battle-hardened Burmese forces were able to push back the British forces because the Burmese who had been fighting in the jungles of Manipur and Assam for nearly a decade, were more familiar with the terrain, which represented a formidable obstacle to the march of a European force. Uzana had already defeated the British units in Kasha and Jaintia in January 1824. In May, Burmese forces led by Usar, Lord Mayawadi, fought their way into Bengal, and defeated British troops at the Battle of Ramu, 10 miles east of Cox's Bazar on 17 May 1824. Saz column then joined Bandula's column on the march to defeat British forces at Gadorpala, and went on to capture Cox's Bazar. The Burmese success caused extreme panic in Chittagong and in Calcutta. Across the eastern Bengal, the European inhabitants formed themselves into militia forces, and a large portion of the crews of the East India Company's ships were landed to assist in the defence of Calcutta. But Bandula, not wanting to overstretch, stopped Usar from proceeding to Chittagong. Had Bandula marched on to Chittagong, which unbeknown to him was lightly held, he could have taken it and the way to Calcutta would have been open. Had they been able to threaten Calcutta, the Burmese could have obtained more favorable terms in the peace negotiations later on. Inside Burma, Battle of Yangon. Instead of fighting in hard terrain, the British took the fight to the Burmese mainland. On the 11th of May 1824, a British naval force of over 10,000 men entered the harbour of Yangon, taking the Burmese by surprise. The Burmese, pursuing a scorched earth policy, left an empty city behind and chose to fortify positions along an east-west 10-mile arc outside the city. The British forces led by General Archibald Campbell took position inside a fortified Shwedagon pagoda compound. The British launched attacks on Burmese lines, and by July 1824, had successfully pushed the Burmese towards Kamayut, 5 miles from Shwedagon. Burmese efforts to retake Shwedagon in September failed. King Bagayador ordered a near-complete withdrawal from the Western Front, Bandula from Arakan and Bengal, and Uzana from Assam, Kasha and Jaintia, and meet the enemy in Yangon. In August, in the midst of monsoon season, Bandula and his army crossed the Arak and Yoma, moving tens of thousands of men over the 3,000-foot-high Arakan hills, or 10,000-foot-high Assamese ranges, heavily forested with only narrow footpaths and open to attack by tigers and leopards, would be difficult even in mild weather conditions. To do this at the height of the drenching monsoon season was a particularly difficult task. Yet Bandula and Uzana, in a testament to their generalship and logistical skills, managed to do just that. The king granted both Bandula and Uzana the title Agamahathinapati, the highest possible military rank. Bandula was also made the governor of Sitarung. By November, Bandula commanded a force of 30,000 massed outside Yangon. Bandula believed that he could take on a well-armed British force of 10,000 head-on. Although the Burmese were numerically superior, only 15,000 of the 30,000 had muskets. The Burmese cannons fired only balls, whereas the British cannons fired exploding shells. Unbeknown to him, the British had just received the first shipment of the newest weapon in war that the Burmese had never seen, Congreve rockets. More ominous for the Burmese, the speedy march through the hilly regions of Rakhine, Yoma and Assamese ranges had left their troops exhausted. On the 30th of November, in what turned out to be the biggest mistake of his career, Bandula ordered a frontal attack on British positions. The British, with far superior weaponry, withstood several Burmese charges at the Shwedagon fort, cutting down men by the thousands. By the 7th of December, the British troops, supported by rocket fire, had begun to gain the upper hand. On the 15th of December, the Burmese were driven out of their last remaining stronghold at Kokina. In the end, only 7,000 of the 30,000 Burmese soldiers returned. Battle of Danubu. Bandula fell back to his rear base at Danubu, a small town not far from Yangon, in the Irrawaddy Delta. Having lost experienced men in Yangon, the Burmese forces now numbered about 10,000, of mixed quality. including some of the king's best soldiers but also many untrained and barely armed conscripts. The stockade itself stretched a mile along the riverbank, and was made up of solid teak beams no less than 15 feet high. In March 1825, a 4,000-strong British force supported by a flotilla of gunboats attacked Dabo. The first British attack failed, and Bandula attempted a counter-charge with foot soldiers, cavalry and 17 fighting elephants. But the elephants were stopped by rocket fire and the cavalry found it impossible to move against the sustained British artillery fire. On the 1st of April, the British launched a major attack, pounding down on the town with their heavy guns and raining their rockets on every part of the Burmese line. Bandula was killed by a mortar shell. Bandula had walked around the fort to boost the morale of his men, in his full insignia under a glittering golden umbrella, discarding the warnings of his generals that he would prove an easy target for the enemy's guns. After Bandula's death, the Burmese evacuated Dabo. Arakan campaign Usar was left to command the remaining Burmese troops in Arakan after Bandula and the main battalions were ordered to withdraw from Arakan by Bagayador to meet the British invasion in Yangon in August 1824. Sir held on to Arakan throughout 1824 while the main focal point of the war played out in Yangon. After Gen. Archibald Campbell finally defeated Gen. Bandula in the Battle of Yangon in December 1824, the British turned their sights to Arakan. On the 1st of February 1825, an invasion force of 11,000 soldiers supported by a flotilla of gunboats and armed cruisers along the coast and a squadron of cavalry under the command of Gen. Morrison attacked Burmese positions in Arakan. Despite their superior numbers and firearms, the British had to fight depleted Burmese forces for nearly 2 months before they reached the main Burmese garrison at Maralku, Arakan's capital. On the 29th of March 1825, the British launched their attack on Maralku. After a few days of fighting, the Burmese at Maralku were defeated on April 1. Coincidentally, the same day Maha Bandula fell at Dabo. Sar and the remaining Burmese forces evacuated and left Arakan. The British proceeded to occupy the rest of Arakan. Armistice on 17 September 1825. An armistice was concluded for 1 month. In the course of the summer, General Joseph Wanton Morrison had conquered the province of Arakan, in the north. The Burmese were expelled from Assam, and the British had made some progress in Kashmir, though their advance was finally impeded by the thick forests and jungle. Peace negotiations that began in September broke down by early October after the Burmese would not agree to British terms. The British had demanded no less than the complete dismemberment of the Burmese Western Territories in Arakan, Assam, Manipur and the Tenasserim coast, as well as £2 million of indemnity. The Burmese would not agree to give up Arakan and the large sum of indemnity. Battle of Proma in November 1825, the Burmese decided to throw everything they had into last-ditch effort. Starting in mid-November, the Burmese forces, consisting mainly of Shan regiments led by their Sorbis, threatened Proma in a daring circular movement that almost surrounded the town and cut off communications lines to Yangon. In the end, the superior firepower of the British guns and missiles won out. On the 1st of December, Gen. Campbell, with 2,500 European and 1,500 Indian sepoys, supported by a flotilla of gunboats, attacked the main Burmese position outside Proma. On the 2nd of December, Mahani Myo was killed by a shell launched from the flotilla. After Mahani Myo's death, the British dislodged the Burmese by the 5th of December. The defeat in Proma effectively left the Burmese army in disarray. The Burmese army was in constant retreat from then on. On the 26th of December, they sent a flag of truce to the British camp. Negotiations having commenced, the Burmese were forced to accept the British terms to end the war, signing the Treaty of Yan Dabo in February 1826. Treaty of Yan Dabo. The British demanded and the Burmese agreed to cede to the British Assam, Manipur, Rakhine, and Tananayi coasts south of the Salween River cease all interference in Kashmir and Jain should pay an indemnity of £1 million in 4 installments, allow for an exchange of diplomatic representatives between Ava and Calcutta, sign a commercial treaty in due course. The first installment of indemnity was to be paid immediately. The second installment within the first 100 days from signing of the treaty, and the rest within 2 years. Until the second installment was paid, the British would not leave Yangon. The Treaty of Yan Dabo was signed by General Campbell from the British side and Governor of Legaring Maham in İğəleiʔ or HTIN from the Burmese side on 24 February 1826. The Burmese paid £250,000 in gold and silver bullion as the first installment of the indemnity, and also released British prisoners of war. The war was thus brought to an end, and the British Army moved south. The British Army remained in the territories surrendered to it under the treaty and in the territories such as the Rangoon area, which were occupied for several years in guarantee of the financial terms of the treaty. Aftermath. The treaty imposed a severe financial burden to the Burmese kingdom, and effectively left it crippled. The British terms in the negotiations were strongly influenced by the heavy cost in lives and money which the war had entailed. Some 40,000 British and Indian troops had been involved, of whom 15,000 had been killed. The cost to the British India's finances had been almost ruinous, amounting to approximately £13 million. The cost of war contributed to a severe economic crisis in India, which by 1833 had bankrupted the Bengal Agency houses and cost the British East India Company its remaining privileges, including the monopoly of trade to China. For the Burmese, the treaty was a total humiliation and a long-lasting financial burden. A whole generation of men had been wiped out in battle. The world the Burmese knew of conquest and martial pride, built on the back of impressive military success of the previous 75 years, had come crashing down. The court of Ava could not come to terms with the loss of the territories, and made unsuccessful attempts to get them back. An uninvited British resident in Ava was a daily reminder of the humiliating defeat. In addition, the burden of indemnity left the Burmese royal treasury bankrupt for years. The indemnity of £1 million was considered a large sum in Europe at that time. It appeared more daunting when converted to the Burmese kyat equivalent of 10 million. The cost of living of the average villager in Upper Burma in 1826 was 1 kyat per month. The British would wage 2 more wars, less expensive, against the weaker Burmese in 1852 and 1885, and annex Burma by 1885. In fiction, On the Irrawaddy by G.A. Henty is a fictional account of the First Anglo-Burmese War. The first few chapters of the novel The Sabre's Edge by Alan Mallinson are set during the First Anglo-Burmese War.